Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of Set Listing Bruce, your podcast all about Bruce Springsteen, his music, and mostly his fans. I am your host, Jesse Jackson. We are getting off the Bruce train. I was spending a few minutes talking to my guest, and he says, I like music, but if you can somehow connect my book with about the Holocaust to music, I really want to hang out with you. And I told him I couldn't promise that, Martin, but I promised we'd have a lot of fun. Martin Bodek, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Jesse, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah.
I'm not really sure at the start of our conversation how we're going to fuse our two interests,
Yeah.
but perhaps as we're talking, some bridge might become obvious, and we'll run with it.
Yeah. Speaking of bridge, you mentioned Billy Joel's one of your favorite musicians, also Joe Cocker. So we'll get by with a little help from our friends, I think.
Perfect.
So, yeah. So why don't you tell us a little about yourself?
Let's see. Born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. I live here in Teaneck, New Jersey, with my wonderful wife and three children. I am a music fan. Nothing obsessive. I like very old school hip hop. I like the hard stuff. I just came back from a Judas Priest concert with my son, who was into metal, which is an interesting thing. Mostly raised on 80s synth pop. I partake in the 30-second song challenge at 7:30 every day while I'm carpooling my kids, and I can get those 7 songs very frequently in the first 30 seconds. I am a voracious, which is how I became a voracious writer, because if you read, you're already halfway there, which is a pretty cool thing. I always tell people, especially in these podcasts and when I'm in front of a crowd, talking about my books. With most things, especially music, just because you admire a band doesn't mean you're any closer to being a guitar god. But
Right.
if you read a lot, you are already halfway to mastering what it means to be a great writer. So I always felt that I was halfway to being a great writer. I'm not a great writer yet. I'm just a writer. I'll leave the greatness to the judgment of others, but I write furiously. Basically, I write from 5 to 9, and I work from 9 to 5. And I intend to write a stack of books that's as tall as I am. Several writers have managed to accomplish that. One of them is Christopher Hitchens. He had a stack of his own books next to his desk, and I love that picture of him sitting there toiling away with his book towering over him. I'm after the same thing. Mm-hmm.
I love that. Can why I've never heard that before, that you feel like if you're a strong reader, you're halfway to being a writer. What and I told you we'd go off on tangents. What
That's fine.
what makes you think of that? Why do you think that?
I do not speak of my own accord. Many famous writers have said this. One famous one was Stephen King, the god, the man himself,
Yeah.
and many other writers, including Hemingway, who basically said if you want to be a great writer, start reading and you'll get there. At a certain point, oh, what is quality and what is not. And you inherently, from absorbing everything, you know what is good and what isn't, and what rules to follow and what not, and what rules can stick to and what can be abandoned. It's not my own saying. It's not a neologism of my own. I believe it's very true. And it's very obvious also that in other fields, and specifically with music, you could love a band for 50, 60 years. It doesn't mean you can step up there and take over on the piano. It doesn't mean that at all. And if you don't if you're not born with a great voice, just because you admire a great vocalist, does not mean you're any closer. But writing is very different. Writing is, you are halfway there if you read like a madman or a mad person.
Yeah, I'm a big reader, and I often think that when you daydream about writing a book, you're daydreaming all the easy parts, like being at a book signing and doing this versus the hard work. And I can't remember if it was Lawrence Block or someone. For some reason, I think it was Lawrence Block, but I'm not sure. But someone said that you should, if you want to be a writer, first off, if you write, you're a writer. But secondly, if you are serious about it, then you need to put the time in, right? And if you say you don't have time to write, then you should spend an hour a day listing all the reasons that's stopping you from writing. And you'll very quickly realize that you just don't want to write. and you will go, oh, if I've had a time to put this, I could have spent writing. So I think it's interesting that you get up early before the day gig to spend the time writing.
That's what I do. I put my family to sleep and I get up and I go writing.
Yeah.
And then I'm up well before everybody. That's the weekends and the week. And it's a routine part of my life because this is what I want to be doing. I love a great quote by Christopher Hitchens, and I always circle back to him in conversation. He's my idol as far as writing goes and human expression. He says, "A writer is what I am rather than what I do." And he said this at the end of his life when he was ill. And he was asked, "How can you stand it? You don't believe in a higher power. Why don't you just end it?" And he was basically very candid. And he said, "As long as I have my faculties, as long as I'm able to write, then I'm going to stick with this, even though I'm suffering. A writer is what I am rather than what I do. And if I can produce it, I'm going to do it." And I think he was able to do that all the way to the end. So I am still of healthy body and mind. And a writer is what I am rather than what I do. It is never a chore for me. It is never difficult to carve the time. It's part of my being. It's part of the corpus of my personality. And it's always something I want to get to when I'm doing anything else. Pretty much. I wish I walked around with the keyboard while I'm doing anything, including the things I enjoy, like ball games and concerts and travel.
And I believe Christopher Hitchens was Gillette was is a fan of his. It talks about him on his podcast. So I know we were going to get off on tangents, but I do like to start at the beginning. So talk about where do you grow up? And I'm going to ask this two ways, two parts. One, what kind of music was your family listening to? And then two, were you in a family of readers? You talked about you being a reader, but was that influenced by your parents?
It was not, but we'll start first things first, second things second.
Okay.
So my house, as I recall, was filled with music. There were vinyl albums. My mother is a huge Elvis Presley fan, and we have some records that might be worth a great deal. We have the Blue Suede album, the blue one,
Yeah.
and that's an item of interest and value. The Bee Gees and Donna Summer and so forth, Sly and the Family Stone, that was going on in the background all the time. But the music that I played was the music that I listened to. I actually remember the first video I ever saw on MTV. I think it was the second day that MTV existed. It was Total Eclipse of the Heart. That was the first video I ever saw, and I was imprinted from that day forward. I am an 80s music lyric aficionado. All these contests where they play 3 seconds of a song and name that song cold. I'm your
You're
guy.
just that you're good at that, right?
Oh, that's yeah, totally, absolutely. I could be your phone a friend in
Well, good.
situations like that.
So I had a wonderful story. There is hurdle, right? There's wordle, there's hurdle, right? Where you
Yes, I play that all
yeah,
the time.
yeah,
Yes, absolutely. And there's Bandle now, but let's not digress.
yeah. No, and Kayla Padilla was going to Penn studying business, and she was a huge Springsteen fan. And she actually she was there on a basketball scholarship. And she decided that Springsteen should have their own hurdle. And
Okay.
so she taught herself enough coding to do Springsteen hurdle. And so I was going, okay, you're going to the Wharton School, you're playing Division I college basketball, you taught yourself coding, you may be an overachiever. And Kayla kind of laughed. So
You
yeah,
might be an overachiever if, yeah.
yeah. So that's awesome. I am one of those that I know it. Yeah, that's hilarious. So you talked about I grew up where my mom read some, my dad read some, but as my mom said, because I'm Jesse Wayne in the South, right? You would never see Jesse Wayne without a book, right? So I was that kind of kid where I just was reading. I get my first remembrance is reading comic books, and the moment I discovered books, I was just everything from the library, mythology books to Louis L'Amour westerns, just whatever I could find, I read. So how about you?
So my family was not a family of readers that sprouted out of myself what's the phrase, ex nihilo of
Yeah.
its own accord. When the first books that I read, I remember where I used to read the Guinness Book of World Records cover to cover back when it was a
Wow.
paperback. Yeah, back when it
Okay.
was a paperback instead of those monstrous color packed things that have
Yeah.
different things every year. Boo. I like it
Yeah.
better
I
when
remember
it's a
those
soft cover.
too. Yes.
Yeah, those are so much better. Encyclopedia Brown is what I absorbed like crazy, Baseball Digest. And then when I was way too young to be permitted this kind of stuff, Stephen King. I remember the first book I ever read was The Tommyknockers, followed by The Shining, and I was way too young for that. But I fell in love with the genre. I read Dean Koontz, Robert McCammon, Clive Barker, and things of that nature, cover to cover. But I have the mind of an engineer. Anything that I dabble with or touch, I like to know how it was put together. I always like to know a thing's process. Along with being a voracious reader, I wanted to deconstruct how these people were telling their stories. So I used to write short stories all the time, starting when I was 6 years old, and submitting it to publications and getting absolutely every single one rejected. But that didn't dissuade me at all. I knew that it's simply what I wanted to do. And that's just where it began, completely of its own accord. Once I was in a library, I couldn't get enough of what I was surrounded by. And I read now 60, 70 books a year, which is actually small potatoes compared to truly voluminous readers, but that's what the schedule allows. And most of the other time is spent writing. Stephen King, we keep coming back to him, famously sits at Boston Red Sox games with a novel in his hand, and he gives his approbations to several books. That's actually when he's reading them at the ball
Yeah.
games.
The I remember I've never been a fan of horror. Just a kid, just was a scaredy cat as they called us. I remember staying up watching The Ghost of Mrs. Chicken with with Don Knotts and being
Okay.
afraid. I had a wonderful friend who's now passed, but he said, "I need you to read this book." And I said, "No, I don't read scary books." He goes, "I need you to read this book." And he gave me The Dead Zone.
Ah, okay.
And so I pushed back. He goes, "Jesse, trust me, I need you to read this book." And I fell in love with Stephen King's writing. And and so I still am not a horror fan, but I'm a Stephen King fan, right? And some of the books get pretty dark. I remember Pet Cemetery, I was like, I never want to read this book again. Right? I
That
never
makes
want to
you
be
not want to
back in
read
that world.
again.
Yeah, I don't want to be involved in that world again. While others, I just loved being in there. And so that's cool. That is very cool. So here's a connection. I had a writer, Ron Martz, who has written multiple comic books for just multiple genres. And he said in college, he could not stand Stephen King or or Bruce Springsteen. He
Mhm.
disdained both of them. He said, now they are my two biggest influences of writing. He says, I came to embrace their storytelling. And so there's our Bruce connection on that.
Okay,
Um,
excellent.
yeah. So where have you did some self evaluation on where you think this need to tell stories came from?
I do know that, and this is getting extremely personal, but I'm thrilled to share. I don't want to pass through this life just, I remember a t shirt, birth, school, Metallica, death.
Okay.
No, that the dash piece, actually, which reminds me, there's this guy on social media, the School of Hard Knocks. Have you ever heard of this fellow? He strolls up to people in expensive vehicles and asks them what they do for a living and starts asking them about their businesses and entrepreneurial style and pulls out, extracts the really good nuggets of information. And he said the most powerful piece of advice he ever got from anyone was a person who told him that his mentor took him to a cemetery and he showed him the tombstone and he showed him the birth year and the death year and the dash in the middle. And he goes, you see that dash? That's where everything happens. That's where everything becomes alchemical. This is the stuff of life. The stuff in the beginning of the end is the beginning of the end, but the middle part is key. So during that dash, I want to do stuff that allows me to live beyond this existence here. I want to exist in libraries. I want people to pick me up well past I'm gone. I want to leave behind something that people remember me by. I don't want to just have passed through this world and just be a non-existent or unnoticed dash. So there's a piece of me that loves to be creative and wants to produce work, and there's this piece of me that wants to leave something behind that's legitimate and concrete. And I can't think of anything more concrete than a library. I'm not a musician. I have no talent for it. I've taken multiple guitar lessons, and I can't hack it. I cannot hack it. I cannot. I tried with the piano, can't hack it. I'm pretty good with drums, but I'm not a pro. But what I can do is write. And once I know I can do something with these good hands, I run with it. And so I've been cranking them out once I decided to put pen to paper.
What's the day gig?
I'm a computer guy. I bill myself as a technologist by day and a writer by night.
Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah, and that's pretty much what I am. I solve people's problems during the day, and I spearhead the solving of people's problems. But as soon as that chapter is closed for the day, I open up the. It used to be the typewriter. It used to be the TRS-80.
Yeah.
My gosh, and now it's this Chromebook that I'm engaging with you on right here.
Do you think that innate need to know how things work served you as you grew as a writer?
Yeah, absolutely. Because plotting and putting things together are basically deconstructing and reconstructing the bits. One of the most amazing plotters and tires up of loose ends
Yeah.
is Charles Dickens. And there are, in some of the back end of some of his books, are the note where he shows, oh, here's a loose end and I've got to tie it. And it looks like a bunch of strings and it's all put together. And that's like ingenious stuff. Malcolm Gladwell is the paragon of this. He will nest things inside of other nested things and just, it's like a matrushka, a Russian doll. It's just
Yeah.
perfectly ensconced. And I aspire to do that. I'm not a good fiction plotter, I've realized. I'm really not that good with that kind of stuff. I'm a better humorist than I am a fiction plotter and a non-fiction storyteller, I found, and a linear storyteller, but it doesn't mean that I can't admire the greats for their art. So I do think of it as a deconstruction and a reconstruction of events and setting things up on a timeline to see how exactly that thing works. And the unraveling and the straightening things out for me is key. And if you don't mind me segueing, so this is the most important book I've written of the 12. It's Sadie's War. It's a story of my grandfather's World War II experience. And he gave me his story over several sessions, years before he passed away. But his memory was all over the place. And I had to grab all these things and decouple the mistakes and some of the stories that were infiltrated by a bit of dementia and set them up on a timeline. So the skills that I had gathered from my previous writing experiences assisted me with setting this thing up. So certainly this reconstruction and tinkering under the hood was able to help me set things in proper order.
So I want to get back to that, but I'd like to start. Did you, as you're exploring, because I always think it's interesting that it's different muscles, right? Writing fiction or writing poetry or writing a history or doing that, can often use different muscles. And I'm amazed at people like Isaac Asimov, right? That is able to flip back and forth over his long career. Did you know, you knew you wanted to be a writer, but did you have originally a thought of what kind of writer you wanted to be?
Yes, I thought it would be fiction for me just because my entire youth was inhabited by fiction reading, all
Yeah.
of it. It began with Stephen King and then it continued with everything he recommended. Therefore, I stayed inside of the horror genre for a bit of a while, but then I started really becoming a fan of everything nonfiction. Most of the stuff I read I like behavioral economics, Gladwell, the Heath brothers, Dan Ariely, such kind of writing, the study of things and how they work, how the world actually works. Vaclav Smil is a favorite writer of mine who simply explains this is how the planet works, this is how everything goes. Those kinds of things really interest me. And it's probably going to be the direction where I want to go, but I'm always coming back to fiction to see where my imagination spins me. One of the projects I'm working on is a book tentatively titled Where Stuff Comes From. And it wasn't so interesting before the pandemic, which was interluded and intercepted by supply line stresses and so forth. I'm very interested in that. Did you know that most of the world's avocados come from Mexico? Most people know that. Did you know that most of the world's pineapples come from Indonesia? It used to be it used to be Hawaii. Did you know that 18% of the world's wheat used to come from Ukraine, and now that's completely decimated and it's shifting elsewhere, and the United States is picking up the slack. That's the kind of stuff I think I can do. Of course, I need that also to be my 9 to 5 because I really got to get out
Yeah.
of my small space and interview people. So that's a project hopefully down the line for me. But that's the kind of stuff that animates me. Fiction is always sitting there noodling at the side of my
Yeah.
brain, waiting to be written. Yes.
When you started writing, what what was your first success with, Martin?
Success. Hold on. I'm going to lean over and disappear off the screen for a
Please,
second.
yes.
I have my own pile of books. Oh boy, it's heavy. Just a moment.
Are you up to your knee yet?
No, I've reached the bottom of my calf, and
Okay,
these are
okay.
my books.
That's a good start. Okay.
Okay, here we are.
Yes.
My first book, I wrote a quasi-religious, quasi-political book, and I called it Bush 2 Book 1.
Okay,
And
funny
you
title.
see, yeah, it says here the New Old Testament. What I did was I turned the first Bush presidency into, don't know if you could see, a King James-esque version of the presidency. And
Very
I just,
interesting.
yeah, I was just hawking around, but I'm still amused to this day about what I came up with. He was a very religious sort, and so I figured the way he is, and his Christian tendencies go well together. But it wasn't successful. Just any first attempt is not going to be successful. Anybody who has a bestseller first time out is a lucky son of a gun.
Yeah.
But my first successful book, was something called the Emoji Haggadah. So this is used on Passover. Passover is the holiday that celebrates the Jews' freedom from Egypt, and we use a Haggadah as a companion to work along the Seder. The Seder is the evening meal. So this is a popular book. It's been around in its original form for 1,000 years. But what I did was convert the entire thing into emojis. And I am, to this day, I believe I'm still the only person in the world ever to write a complete book and convert it completely into emojis. There have been a few others where people came up with their own pictograms. Pictograms is the actual word for emojis.
Yeah.
But I am it. I am your guy. And this is actually, if you can read, that's my name in emoji. All right. If
That's
you can see that,
funny. Yeah.
that's Martine Ebo deck of cards.
That is
So
nice.
this is still my most successful book. This was published in 2019. I've sold a great deal of these, and that is by far my most successful, like by far.
Yeah, and it looks like you've done a series of similar books. I'm looking
Yeah.
at your Amazon page.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's a good page to be looking at.
Yeah.
Uh, but yes, I've become some sort of a parody niche writer as far as Passover goes. That this one begat the next one, begat the next one, begat the next one. So I've written the coronavirus Haggadah. This is
Okay.
a form of comic relief. The Festivus Haggadah. This is for Seinfeld fans.
Yes.
Very proud of this one. Shakespeare Haggadah for literature lovers. And this is my latest from this past year. This Haggadah is the way. This is my Star Wars Haggadah, and this is
Nice.
doing very well as well.
Nice. Yeah, I did see there may be a little bit of a tongue in cheek about our former president, Mr. Trump.
Oh, that's actually, yes, there is. That's across the room. I usually don't show that off because it rankles people. But my wife has been after me for years to write a children's book. You know what? I will disappear once again for 4 seconds,
That's
and I'll
okay.
be right back.
Yeah.
Yeah, so here it is.
Yes.
If you remember Marvin K. Mooney, Would You Please Go Now by Dr. Seuss himself,
Yes.
or actually Dr. Seuss. So I wrote this one. And it's basically a take off of the famous Dr. Seuss book. And yeah, this has been a pretty fantastic seller as well. Highly polarizing. I try to position it as Really, it's just a children's book. I was just having fun.
Yeah.
I can write this for any president because there's a stat: 30% of the population wants their president gone at any moment in time. And that seems to be a very steady thing.
Yeah.
At least 30% want whoever it is out because people are displeased. So you could write this for anybody. I happen to have written it for this. People are amused and people ask me about it. So thanks for asking.
No, I'm glad. My wife and I are very lonely blueberries in a very large strawberry state here in Texas. So, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so it is crazy. I will have to get that for her. So,
Okay.
yeah, that is perfect.
You
So,
can get that on Amazon. I could not monetize it. I wasn't allowed to because I used graphics that I could not afford to pay for.
yeah,
So I had to give this away for free. So you can get it on a Kindle for free.
okay.
Go right ahead and download it and have a good
All
time.
right, perfect. That sounds great. That's awesome. But you shared that you feel that the latest book that is telling your grandfather's story is
Yeah.
your most important book to date. So let's talk a
Yes.
little bit about that. What was the inspiration of, because often we wait till our relative is gone and you go, damn, I should have written those down. And there is certainly a tradition of telling stories over and over again. That there are certain stories of my father, some funny, some sad, but that our loved ones continue to live in the stories that we tell. So talk to me a little bit about your goal and what led to this journey.
So at about the same time that I became turned on to reading itself, my grandfather started sharing his stories with me. And just the way I was exposed to literature when I was too young to absorb it and accept it, he also told me some very disturbing and scary stories when I was probably too young to understand the gravita of what he was telling me. But I did know as a 6, 7, 8 year old that what my grandfather is telling me is something that has to be retold. He can't just sit me down here and tell me these insane, grisly stories of war. One day I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna write a story, and I allowed that vision to come true. So the first book I showed you, the first Bush book was, and my first contract that I ever signed for a book was the Emoji Haggadah, which I showed you, and that was 2019. So it was 9 years of puttering around, not being familiar with the industry until I wrote something of such quality that a publisher reached out to me, and we took it from there. But before I was ever actually officially a writer, because I write, as you mentioned before, I had to get the story. And I took advantage of a moment when I was newly married and my wife had a gig as a chef's helper in New York City. So I had my Thursday nights open. So I thought, oh, okay, I can go hang out with the guys, or I could do what I should have been doing and what I was fated to do since I was 6 or 7 years old. So I called my mom and I said, Naomi, that's my wife. Naomi she's out doing her gig, her interesting thing. Let's sit down with Zaidi. Zaidi is the Yiddish word for grandpa. Let's sit down with him and get him his story. And that's just what we did. So we got his story, several successive Thursday nights. We sat down with him, learned it from him. And when he began to repeat himself, we knew that we've got everything we need. We recorded everything on VHS. You know what VHSs are. Sometimes I speak to crowds who have
Yeah.
no idea.
Yes, exactly.
No idea.
Yes.
And the VHSs, they sat on a shelf for a while because I did not have the chops yet to convert that into a story. I was just an interested grandson who recorded the story.
So I was
Uh,
going to ask you that question. Did
yeah,
you feel that you weren't ready to tell that story yet? You did not, as you said, the chops. I was
I
wondering if that was, I can't, I'm not at the level yet to do justice to this important story.
yes, that's exactly right. I did not have the seasoning or the wherewithal or anything backing me up. I was just a kid in my 20s, and I really had no idea what I was doing. But I knew that as soon as I build up a head of steam of credentials, that it would be time. So signed my first contract in 2019, and that started to snowball. Signed a few more, and once I came out with the Shakespeare Haggadah, I thought to myself, okay, all right, I think I understand how the larger business of this works. It's time to get back to the story that's been pending for a very long time. And that's what I did. So it took me 2 years to translate the Yiddish conversation into English. And that was a very difficult but very forward-moving process. And once that 2 years was up, I had the raw material, and then it was just up to me putting it onto a linear timeline. I didn't want to do tricks of moving back and forth. Many Holocaust memoirs do that. It's very difficult for me to set things up in such a line, as we've discussed. I like linear storytelling. It's easier for me to be a practitioner in that art. And then I marketed it around, and marketing was very easy because one feature of his story is part of the subtitle, and that's the Four Armies bit over here, which certainly attracts a lot of attention, and people always want to know what is up with that. Because as I tell the audiences to whom I bring this story, how do you get to four armies? You can get to two nowadays. You can serve your own country, and you can be what is known as a lone soldier. So that is a phenomenon that is happening now in Ukraine, for example. People are impassioned by their suffering, and they go and sign up and battle for their people and their ideology. Okay, so that's how you can serve two armies in a lifetime. How the heck do you get to four? So that's the story that he told me, and that's the story that I tell here. So I found a great publisher. It's Amsterdam Publishers. They're the largest publisher of Holocaust literature in Europe, and is very proud to be part of their stable of talented and capable authors. And that's how this book came to be.
What surprised you the most as you were trying to tell the story?
When I started doing research as to what he was up to and where certain realities manifested themselves. So one of the biggest shocks was he described that he was captured by the Germans. He was plucked out of a Hungarian military camp. And when he was plucked by the Germans, he was carried off. And the story that he told was that his job was to dig foxholes for the German troops as they were moving forward, and they'd be shot at. By who? He didn't really know. And so I sat down years later while doing the translation, and I tried to figure out where he was on this timeline. And I tried to figure out from all the clues he was giving me as to where he was exactly. And because of the fact that he did not move from his position, meaning he went to the same barracks every day and came back to the same front lines every day, I was like, that's a clue. That's a clue, because he's staying in place. Why is he staying in place? Why does he keep going to the same barracks? Who's firing against him, if not the Americans? What's going on here? Oh, it's 1941. And then I realized, wait a second, he's part of Operation Barbarossa. Operation Barbarossa, and a lot of people don't know this, is the largest military land invasion in human history. And this was Germany's assault on Russia. So the people that were firing at my grandfather and his friends were Russians defending their homeland against the invading Nazi horde. And the reason he wasn't moving is because history also records that there were three fronts on this war. The Germans attacked in the north, in the middle, and in the south. And in the north and the middle, they were known to have made advances. They got very close to Moscow. They did cut off their supply lines, but in the south, they didn't move. The Russians dug in. So putting all this information together, I realized where my father was. He was smack in the middle of the greatest and bloodiest battle on land in human history. And that's just where he was. And I was like, oh my God, Operation Barbarossa. This is insane. That's where he was. So that was the biggest shock. That was just an unbelievable thing once that was revealed through the research and the clues that he gave me about where he was. That was absolutely the biggest bomb that he threw at me.
How, you talked about having to do research, and we are all in our own ways unreliable narrators. So how reliable a narrator was he?
Very reliable. And actually, in the second half of the book, I have the translation of the actual recordings. And people can choose to read that part of the book or not, and that's fine. I would say half the crowd likes to read it and half doesn't. Half thinks, oh, this book is too short. It's only 100 pages, the first part. What are you wasting my time? I'm not wasting your time at all. You don't have to read it if you don't want to.
Yeah.
But a reader would appreciate the difficulty that I had to go through to unravel it. But he was advanced in years. I think he was 83 at the time that I was interviewing him, and some of his memory began to slip. However, before he was ever that age, and before I was ever the age that I was, he was telling me the story for decades. So at any point where something was unclear, I would rely on my own memory of his stories and set things straight. However, also, when I'm speaking in front of crowds, I usually say a little bit of housekeeping before we start off, and that is, I do not believe or trust or assert or aver that I am the world's greatest researcher, I stand to be corrected. This is a living document that I have here, and if anyone in the crowd here knows that I made an error, please tell me. I will get in touch with the editor and we will make that correction. World War II is almost too big to know, and I could easily make mistakes. I once made the mistake of referring to the Soviet Union as Russia. Big mistake. There was a Russian in the crowd who got very upset with me and was waving his finger. And yes, sir, I will not be making that mistake again. And I also made the mistake. Yes.
Finish, please.
Okay, I once made a mistake. So my grandfather was present at the Battle of Berlin, the final battle of World War II, and that was May 8th, 1945. And I declared that my grandfather had signed up with the Russian military. He was conscripted into the army, and that was his fourth army that he was aligned with, that he rolled over the border into Berlin and was ready to kill Nazis on sight because that was the order. However, the convoy was stopped, and the general said that Germany had surrendered. So I made the mistake of saying at that moment, and the war was over. And then somebody goes, no, the war is still raging in the Pacific Theater. I was like, yes, my mistake. Japan is still waging war against the United States, and it's not over, but the war is over in the European theater. And once the bombs drop on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that's when the war ends in the Pacific. So I've made such errors of mispronouncements, but those are just errors of speech as I'm losing track of what I'm saying in front of a crowd.
Sure.
But the research generally holds up. I've not been reprimanded or cautioned or corrected on the actual research. I think I've done as good a job as a human could possibly do.
Did he know you wanted to write this as a book?
Yes, we sat down with him and we explained to him that this was the purpose. In very clear terms, we're sitting here to gain the story of your life so that it can be spread to your family, so that we can understand and love you better, but also so the public can have this important document. And he was totally on board with the project and understood. I did not go into it to trying to pull wool over his eyes or be sneaky about anything. Straight up, he knew what the purpose was.
And what's been the response?
It's been wonderful. It's put me on a speaker circuit, and that's been the most gratifying thing in the world. I have delivered podcasts now. I think you're my 9th state. Are you broadcasting out of Texas?
Yes, I am.
Okay, so I've made it my goal. I'm actually drafting a little blog post declaring that I hope to visit and be podcasted into all 50 states. I think I have 38 to go, but this project has just begun. And it's put me out there into the public. And I actually had a talk this past year specifically targeting all my adult. So it's put me on the map. It's put me on the map as a speaker and not just a writer. And it's been absolutely wonderful and very rewarding and very appreciated by the masses to whom I bring the story.
What is the topic you're speaking of?
But when I bring the story, so I am brought in to speak specifically about this book.
Okay.
There are annual events that are very centered around Yom HaShoah and so forth and so on, Armistice Day, Independence Day, and various other things on the war calendar. And that's generally when I'm brought in to speak. And book clubs still keep these stories alive because we're losing Holocaust survivors at pretty much the same clip that we're losing American GIs. There are not many left. Every few months, there's a society that puts out the numbers and they dwindle very quickly. So it's up to the 3Gs, they're called. I'm a 3G, a third generation survivor. So the 1Gs told their stories. The 2Gs found it difficult to tell their story. There's a lot of trauma there. So there's not that many books written by the children of survivors. So it's the grandchildren who are a little bit more removed and have the emotional space to put these stories into print. So I'm the 3G bringing the story to the people.
That's an interesting thought because I know nothing of this. The idea that it was just to the closest, this is not similar at all, but I once asked my mom, God, talk about Freudian slip. I asked my mom, my dad was career military, 20 years. Mm-hmm. And I asked Mom, hey, do you ever watch that Lifetime series Army Wives? And she said, it's too real to me. No, I can't watch that. And so I could see what you're saying. It's too fresh. Was mother or father? I assume your mother's father?
Yes, mother's father,
okay.
Yes.
How did she feel about this, you sharing the story?
Oh, she's proud of me. The Hebrew word is nachat.
Okay.
When you obtain nachat, which is basically the word for pride and joy from your children, she couldn't be happier. She's the one who facilitated the conversation to begin with. My Yiddish isn't perfect, and he was a native Yiddish speaker. So she facilitated the discussion and was very happy when this came to see the light of day.
That's nice. That's really nice. What's next for you? What's you talk, you've still got that itch for fiction. What's next for you? You ready to do a horror novel?
Always ready to do a horror novel.
Huh.
And I always want to get back to that, but I find myself trying to figure out what's the next Haggadah and what's the next Holocaust book, because I don't want to be a one-trick pony. I don't want to be looked at as just a humorist or just
Mhm.
a morbid or somber storyteller. So I'm working actively on two things. So first, it's the dad jokes Haggadah, actively working on that as we speak. That seems to have an inborn following already. People just giggle their heads off when I tell them about it. And the other Holocaust book that I'm writing is, we can call it a bit of a spin-off, but I'm looking to tell stories from the point of view of objects that have survived World War to be used in the present day, either or their descendants. For example, my grandmother's ring was buried in the earth for the war, and several lines of possession later, my wife has a pendant from that necklace that sits on her neck every single day. And every time I see it, I smile because it's just unbelievable what it's been through, and so forth. And watches that may have traveled over oceans and seas and around the planet to get to people's wrists, like a young great grandchild wearing a watch from what his grandfather had back in the day. And it was born out of a conversation I had with the publisher of this book. The people available to tell stories are rapidly disappearing from the earth, and the only thing left behind are the objects that stood sentient and watched the proceedings of war and post-war. So I think there's something powerful there to be told. So I've started working on that project as well.
Yeah, because I would think you're the second or third generation who now has that watch or the ring or the painting or whatever, they can tell the story of how they got it and what it means to them, right? And
Mm-hmm.
that is, oh, that sounds very interesting.
Tentatively titled "If These Objects Could Talk." I don't have a better title at the moment.
There's nothing wrong with that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I love that. I did want to ask you before we hit record, I did say, do you have a favorite musician? And without thinking, you said Joe Cocker. Tell me why that immediately came to effect. What about Joe and his music spoke to you?
First of all, "With a Little Help from My Friends" is my favorite song of all time,
Okay.
and I love it no matter who performs it. I started with the Beatles, and many other people have come out with versions. Macy Gray has a fantastic version of it. It's a beautiful song. I loved his expressiveness, and I loved his personhood, and I loved his performance. He was just sweating his brains out at a high capacity, and I became imprinted. I go to as many music concerts as I can ever get to, but he's the one that I regret never being able to make it to a concert to, besides for
Yeah.
Tom Petty passed away before I can get a chance. I was looking at tickets. ZZ Top, there's still a chance to catch one of them. I
Yeah.
haven't made my way there, but Joe Cocker's the first regret. I actually just saw Bob Dylan. I didn't want that to pass before I saw him in concert. He came down to Brooklyn, and that was pretty cool. But Joe Cocker's he's amazing. And the Saturday Night Live impression of him, Belushi's famous impression, just makes Cocker himself more endearing.
It really does. Um, so have you seen Bruce?
I've not seen Bruce, but my mom
Yes.
has seen him like 25 times or something.
So we need to get your mom on the podcast, right?
Sure, absolutely. She'd
Yeah.
be honored. She'll talk your head off.
That sounds awesome. Yeah. Good. I recommend you seeing Bruce. Did you enjoy Bob?
Actually, Bob, that was not a super satisfactory experience, and we can't end our chat on that.
No, I
They
won't. I
we'll end
won't. I will.
with okay. We'll end
Yeah.
with the homework on the Bruce Springsteen
Yeah.
question. So Bob Dylan only played his latest album, meaning the crowd was unable to sing along with some of his great stuff because he just wasn't singing it. He was singing stuff that was completely unfamiliar.
Yeah.
And the ushers, upon entry to the hall where he was performing, stole your phone away and stuffed it into one of those iron little bags.
Yeah.
And people were just flummoxed and stymied and upset and trying to break these things open. And all so that Bob Dylan doesn't have people doing waving the lights in his face, and it was completely unsatisfactory. And I went with my dad, who's been a Bob Dylan fan for his entire life, and he leaned over to me towards the end and he goes, "Martin, is that the worst concert you've ever been to in your life?" And I said,
Uh,
"I think it is. I think it is."
so my one of my best friends is a huge Dylan fan. He's seen him, if not 100, it's getting up there. And
Mm.
he said the same thing. He said that he loves hearing, the new album, and he's happy with it. But he said, yeah, as a casual fan, just that's not what he's going to do. And so you and so I've talked about getting the last couple albums and doing my homework beforehand, then going to see, so I'd have that check off, that checklist of seeing him. Yeah, but I was wondering if you're I remember Sam also said the same thing. He went and saw Tom Petty, and I said, "How was it?" He said it was a great show for the casual Petty fan. He did
Mhm.
all the hits. He said, I just would have wanted more of the obscure stuff. And there you go. You do that. Yeah. So I love the fact that you are trying to get those off your checklist, but between writing and working and trying to spend time with the family, I don't know if you have time to see many live shows.
Oh, there's always time. The summer's coming.
Yeah.
You carve out time for the things
Yeah.
you absolutely
Yeah.
love,
Good.
and there is time in the day for that.
So
Absolutely.
are you caught up on King's latest books?
Not his last several. I've found myself reading a lot of nonfiction, so it's crowded out the fiction. I read
Yeah.
85% nonfiction. So I'm going to catch up on that backlog. His latest book is You Like It Darker, and it looks
Yeah.
fantastic.
Yeah.
So I've got to go and grab that.
I really enjoyed Holly, the one before that, that was
Mhm.
set in that universe of the Mr. Mercedes. So I
Mhm.
really enjoyed that a lot. So that's great. Do you, I've had and we're going to wrap up shortly. I've heard interviews with showrunners of TV shows. Like if they work on dramas, they can't watch other dramas because they end up working. Like, oh, why did they do an act break there? What was that doing this? Same thing.
Yeah.
Comedy showrunners will go like, I can't, like that was the joke wasn't right there. They said, but they can watch reality shows or the other genre. Does it do is Are you spending more time with nonfiction because you're working on those muscles?
No, wait, let me just hear how you pose the question. So, wait,
Yeah.
I'm changing it to a yes.
Okay.
So, yes. So, I read as many Haggadahs and Haggadot as I possibly can to give me the grounding and to give me material. And for each one, for each of these that I've cranked out, I have to do a separate piece of research. When I was doing the Festivus Haggadah, yes, I did go back and rewatch every single Seinfeld episode from the beginning, and I sat there with my notes because repeated phrases, repeated
Yeah.
archetypes, and the various things that came up. Yes, I read through the cliff notes of every single Shakespeare play. Michael Gladwell, for example, will always talk about and write articles about every book that he comes out. He'll talk about the 250 books that he had to read.
Yeah.
I'm not exaggerating about the number in order to produce this work.
Yeah.
So I am fully ensconced in the universe I'm in. When I was writing my grandfather's book, I was reading one Holocaust book after another, just because I would be completely surrounded by the material, so that I'm in the right mental space to put this stuff down on paper. So that's what it is. I'm not avoiding anything else. I'm involving myself completely in what it is I'm writing.
And it's probably too specific to do a Springsteen, but maybe a rock and roll one, because just a thought that there is a huge Springsteen fandom out there. So
Oh,
they
yes,
would
I
go
know.
for that. Yes. That's awesome. Martin, what should I've asked you that I haven't? And we'll end with you telling where people can find you and we'll do the Mary question. But is there any question I should have asked you that I haven't?
No, I think you've covered a lot of angles, and we've dodged in and out, and we've managed to fuse music and loves and so forth and so on. We got it all covered. There are no regrets here.
I had a little faith, right? As they have a little faith, there's magic in the night. I knew we do this. Martin, this has been so much fun. I appreciate it. So I'm going to let you have final words in a minute. But if you are a fan of Martin, and his works. And this is why you're checking out the podcast. Thank you so much. It has been a joy talking to him. But I end every podcast with the Mary question. And what that is, Jay Armstrong, a former high school teacher from the Philly area. He's now retired. But when he was teaching, he would give his students the lyrics to Thunder Road, and they would read them together. They would discuss the themes and the imagery that Bruce portrays in that song. And then at the end of the class, he would ask his students, does Mary get in the car? So, Martin, that was your homework. Does Mary get in the car at the end of Thunder Road?
Okay, I'll answer the question, but first let me say, if people are interested in my work, please drop by martinbodekbooks.com. I'll be happy to meet you there. Please feel free to browse around, contact me, jump on my mailing list, and have yourself a good time. As for the Mary question, it's a fantastic question, and it was really exciting to field it. So I went and reread all the lyrics, and I did not make my mind up just yet. Once I was done reading the lyrics, it was time for me to pick up my wife from the bus stop. She was coming home from work, and I said, "Hey, I'm on the podcast tonight, and this guy Jesse asked this amazing question." And I said, "Look at the lyrics of Thunder Road and give me your decision." So she said to me, "She doesn't get in the car." So I said, "Okay, hold on." Came home, called my mom, the Bruce Springsteen fan, and I said, "Okay, I'm on this podcast tonight, and gave me this homework. What do you think the answer is?" She goes, "Yeah." She starts singing every lyric from beginning to end by heart, and she goes, "No, she doesn't get in the car." But I think otherwise. I'm going to argue with them because Mary was going somewhere. She slammed the door behind her, and she was headed. So she wasn't going shopping. She was headed into the car, and he does an amazing job of conniving and convincing and cajoling her into the car. And I really can't see that she says no. The only reason that she may have said no is at the beginning of the song when he says, "You're not a beauty, but it's all right." And she may have been insulted by that. So maybe that's why he's so busy entreating her the entire time, because he realized he made an error with that slip.
He
But
said Russia when he should have said Soviet Union, and he
yes,
said the
exactly.
war ended, and you only meant the European phase. But yes, that's Bruce,
Right.
right?
So that's my theory. My theory is he's spending so long trying to get her into the car because of that minor's faux pas,
Okay.
but eventually she must forgive him and jumps in and head down Thunder Road. That's just my opinion. But
Do you think your lovely bride and your sainted mother, because he called him ugly? That's what my wife says. No, she didn't get in the car. He called her ugly.
so it sounds like there's a gender divide here.
Yeah.
The people who are insulted say no, she wouldn't get into the car with him after that insult. But I say, boy, that guy was working overtime to correct his error.
Yeah. So in my mind, that I always think that Mary talks about that a lot. Mary says, I'm getting older. I'm not that attractive anymore. I'm not looking good. Who would want me? And so I think in the terms of like when you're selling and you take your prospect's objection and you belittle, you diffuse it, like, hey, you're not a beauty, but hey, you're all right, and I'm no hero. That's understood. So yeah, 50-50. About 50 people say yes, she gets in the car, 50% say no, and then I have and I realize that makes it over 100, but there's a few percentages that leave it vague. They're like, I don't think we can tell. I think that's the purpose of the song, and some other theories, but this is absolutely great. Martin, I loved spending time with you, and I'm so glad that we got to check off Texas on your list. Any final thoughts? And please, once again, how to find you.
Final thoughts. It's been a wonderful evening with you. It's been an absolute pleasure. I would recommend that you break out the opinion about Mary by gender, because I think find it very interesting, because it won't be 50-50. It'll be skewed in a different direction. And again, it's been amazing. I would recommend trying to pose this question for any different song. I can't think of another one where something might be vague and you could get an interesting opinion. I know my brain will work overtime to try to find one. You could have a whole course on this
And
music study.
yeah, this really did happen, that Jay was on the phone. He was being interviewed from me, and he mentioned that he spent 2 whole days with his honors English class doing this. And I was like, wait a minute, of course she gets in the car. It's not even a question. And he says, if you technically, the words are, I'm pulling out of here to win. I'm like, what?
Ah, uh-oh.
What? Wait a minute. And so I was so impressed with the question. And 80, 90% of my guests, whether they're a Springsteen fan or not, love the question. It has worked out to be a great way to end the discussion because they're just like, man, I'm so glad you asked this question. And whether they're a fanatic Springsteen fan or not, it's a fun way to end. So thank you for being that. All right, guys, it is Zadie's. Is that how, am I saying it
Yep,
right?
correct.
Zadie's War, 4 armies, 3 continents, 2 brothers, one man, impossible story, and it is available wherever you find books. I will include Martin's Facebook page. I will include his Twitter, aka X, and his blog. We didn't even get to talk about your blog. Hopefully, when you've got another book to peddle and you wanted to join, I'd love to have you back.
I would love to be back. I will crank out books to make that happen.
Okay. And have your mom reach out to your mom, and I'd love to have her on. That would be
Okay,
a blast. Okay.
that message will be relayed.
All right, thank you. All right, listeners, check out the website, check out the Facebook page, go look at some of the books. If you sign up for the mailing list, let them know you heard about it on Set Listing Bros. For now, everyone be safe, be kind, and we'll talk to you soon. Goodbye.